I came home from 10 days in Phoenix caring for my brother after his hip replacement, and the first thing I noticed was that my wife had lost weight. Not the kind you notice after a long absence and chalk up to a different haircut or lighting. Real weight. The kind that comes from not eating. She was standing at the kitchen sink when I walked in, and when she turned around, I saw it immediately, the hollows under her eyes. The way her blouse hung off her shoulder like it belonged to someone larger. She smiled when she saw me, but it didn't reach her eyes. I set my bag down and hugged her, and she held on a little too long. I told myself she had just missed me. I told myself 10 days was a long time for two people who had been married 38 years and had never spent more than 3 nights apart. I told myself a lot of things in those first few minutes that I would later understand were wrong. My name is not important. What is important is that I am 64 years old, retired after 31 years as a civil engineer, and I have spent the better part of my adult life building things that were meant to last. Bridges, drainage systems, a marriage, a family. You learn, in that kind of work, to look at a structure and identify where the stress fractures are before they become catastrophic failures. You learn to read the signs. I should have read them sooner. My wife and I built our life in a quiet neighborhood outside of Columbus, Ohio. We raised 2 children in the house, where we still live, a daughter and a son. Our son moved to Seattle 8 years ago, married a good woman, and built a life there. We see him at Thanksgiving and Christmas, and sometimes in the summer. And every time we do, it reminds me that we did something right with that one. Our daughter was always the complicated one. I say that with love, because I do love her. I have loved her since the moment she was born, and I will love her until the moment I die. But love is not the same as blindness. And if I am being honest, which I intend to be, throughout everything I am about to tell you, there were signs about her character that I chose not to see clearly for a very long time. She married her husband 7 years ago. He was charming the first time I met him. The kind of man who makes strong eye contact and laughs at the right moments and says things like, "Sir" and "ma'am," while somehow making it feel completely natural. My wife liked him immediately. I was more cautious, but I told myself that was just a father's instinct, that reflexive suspicion any man feels when another man enters his daughter's life. I gave him the benefit of the doubt. That is, I think, the sentence I will regret most for the rest of my life. He ran what he called a consulting business. The nature of the consulting was always vague, something about connecting investors with small regional businesses, taking a finder's fee on both ends. He never seemed to struggle financially, but he also never seemed to have a period of sustained, visible success. There was always a deal about to close, always a partnership about to be formalized, always a reason that the windfall was just around the next corner. My daughter worked in hospital administration and made a reasonable salary. Between the two of them, they lived well enough. They had a house in a suburb 20 minutes from ours, a car that was slightly newer than they could probably afford, and a lifestyle built on the quiet assumption that eventually his ship would come in. I paid for their wedding, $63,000, because my wife wanted her daughter to have the day she had always imagined, and I was not going to be the man who said no to that. I also paid off $12,000 of their credit card debt the year after the wedding, because my daughter came to me crying and said they had gotten underwater and she was scared, and I wrote the check because watching my daughter cry has always made me incapable of saying no. My wife knew about that check. We agreed it was a one-time thing. It was not a one-time thing. Over the following 4 years, there were smaller amounts, $3,000 here, $5,000 there, a car repair, a medical bill, a deposit on a storage unit for business inventory that I never fully understood. Each time, my daughter came to me alone. Each time, she presented it as an emergency. Each time, I told my wife about it afterward. And each time, my wife said the same thing. At some point, we have to let them figure it out themselves. And each time, I agreed. And each time, a few months later, the cycle repeated. I did not add up the total until later. When I finally did, sitting at my kitchen table with a legal pad and 4 years of bank statements, the number was $91,000. But that is getting ahead of the story. My brother's surgery was scheduled for a Tuesday. His wife passed 3 years ago, and his children live in Denver and Atlanta, too far to get there quickly. I was the closest family he had, and so I drove to Phoenix on a Sunday, planning to be there through his recovery, however long it took. My wife had insisted she would be fine. She was healthy. She had friends nearby. She had her book club on Thursday. She would call me every night. She did call me every night. For the first 6 nights. On the 7th night, she did not call. I called her at 8 o'clock, and it went to voicemail. I called again at 9, and again at 10. I told myself she had probably fallen asleep early. She does that sometimes, especially in the winter, when the dark comes early and the house gets quiet. I sent a text. I turned off the light and tried to sleep, and I mostly failed. The next morning she answered on the second ring. She said she was fine. She said her phone had died and she had forgotten to plug it in. Her voice sounded off to me thin, somehow, like she was speaking from a distance. But I was 4 states away with my brother barely 2 weeks out from surgery, and I did not know what to do with what I was sensing. I asked her 3 times if she was sure everything was okay. She said yes, 3 times. I believed her, or I wanted to believe her, which at that distance amounts to the same thing. I came home 3 days later. That first evening, I made dinner while she sat at the kitchen table and talked to me about nothing in particular, a neighbor's dog, a television show she had been watching, whether we should repaint the guest bathroom in the spring. Normal conversation, but her eyes kept drifting away from me, and twice I had to repeat a question because she simply had not heard it. When I suggested we go to bed early, she looked almost relieved. I lay awake for a long time listening to her breathe. The next morning I asked her directly. I sat down across from her at the breakfast table, set both of my hands flat on the surface so she could see I was serious, and I said, "I need you to tell me what happened while I was gone." She looked at her coffee cup for a long moment. Then she looked at me, and then she cried. I am going to tell you what she told me, because it matters that you hear it from her perspective. She asked me, later, if I would tell the story that way. She said she wanted people to understand that it did not happen all at once. That is the part that people don't always understand about this kind of thing. It doesn't happen all at once. It started 3 days after I left for Phoenix. My son-in-law came to the house alone. My daughter was at work. He said he was in the neighborhood and thought he would stop by to check on her. And my wife, who genuinely likes to have company and who has never seen anything wrong with her son-in-law dropping by, let him in and made him coffee. He sat at that same kitchen table and talked to her for almost 2 hours. He told her his consulting business had hit a serious problem, a contract dispute with a client that was threatening to become a lawsuit. He said the legal fees were going to be significant. He said he and my daughter were stressed and scared. He said he hadn't told my daughter the full extent of it yet because he didn't want her to panic. Then he said he had a solution. A bridge loan, he called it. A short-term transfer from our investment account to his business account, just enough to cover the legal retainer while he waited for a separate deal to close, which he said would happen within 30 days. He would pay it back with interest. He had documents. My wife asked how much. He said $40,000. My wife said no. He came back the next day. My daughter came with him that time. They sat together across from my wife at that same table, and my daughter cried, which my wife has the same weakness to as I do, and they walked through the numbers again, and this time, my daughter said that if they couldn't cover the legal retainer, her husband might lose his business license entirely, and then they would lose the house. And what would happen to them then? She asked my wife if she wanted that. She said, "Mom, we have nowhere else to turn." My wife still said no. She said she needed to talk to me first. My son-in-law said there wasn't time to wait for me to get back. He said the payment was due by the end of the week. He said, very carefully, that he didn't think it was necessary to worry me while I was taking care of my brother. He said I had enough on my plate. He said my wife was capable of making this decision herself. He said, and this is the part that my wife repeated to me twice to make sure I heard it correctly, that my wife had always struck him as a woman who could handle things independently. They came back 3 more times over the next 4 days. The 4th time, My son-in-law brought documents. A loan agreement, typed and formatted to look official. A repayment schedule. A letter, supposedly from his attorney, outlining the urgency. My wife later showed me these documents. The loan agreement was real enough in its structure, but the attorney's letter had a firm name that, when I later searched for it, did not exist in the state of Ohio. My wife signed the loan agreement and transferred $35,000 from our joint savings account to an account number he provided. She was sitting across from me now at that same kitchen table, and she was not crying anymore. She was looking at me steadily, and I could see it had cost her something to get to steady, and I was not going to waste that by making her feel worse. I asked her why she hadn't called me. She said she knew I would have come home, and my brother needed me there. She said she thought it would be resolved quickly. She said, quietly, that she was also a little afraid of how I would react, not to her, but to them, and she had not been ready to watch me react to them. 38 years of marriage, and that sentence was the most honest thing I had heard in a long time. I reached across the table and covered her hand with mine, and I told her she had nothing to apologize for. I told her she was right that I would have come home. I told her that what they had done was not her failing. It was theirs. It was entirely theirs. Then I went into my office and closed the door, and I sat very still for a while. I am not a man who makes decisions in anger. I learned a long time ago, in the early years of my career, that the most dangerous thing you can do with a structural problem is react to it emotionally before you understand it fully. A crack in a foundation wall can look catastrophic and turn out to be superficial. It can also look superficial and turn out to be catastrophic. You do not know until you have gathered all of the information. Then you act. And when you act completely. I started with the bank. I called our financial institution that afternoon and spoke with the fraud department. I explained what had happened. My wife had transferred funds under duress, following a pattern of repeated pressure that I believed constituted elder financial abuse under Ohio law. The representative told me to file a written report and to contact local law enforcement, which I intended to do. They flagged our account and added additional security measures. Then I called our attorney. I have worked with the same attorney for 20 years, a precise, methodical man who has drafted our wills, handled 2 property transactions, and reviewed every significant financial decision we have made as a couple. I told him everything. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he said 4 things. He said what had happened likely constituted financial exploitation of an elderly person under Ohio Revised Code, which is a felony. He said the fake attorney's letter could constitute fraud. He said the pattern of repeated visits and pressure could be construed as coercion, and he said I should not contact my daughter or my son-in-law before we had a clear plan. I thanked him and told him I had already figured that last part out on my own. Over the next 2 days, I assembled documentation. I pulled every bank record related to the transfer. I photographed the loan agreement and the fraudulent attorney's letter. I wrote a detailed timeline of every financial transfer I had made to my daughter and son-in-law over the past 4 years. Every check, every electronic transfer, every amount and date. The total, as I mentioned, was $91,000. Add the $35,000 from our savings, and in 4 years, they had taken or manipulated us out of $126,000. I also called our son in Seattle. He answered on the second ring, the way he always does. I told him everything. He was silent for a long moment, and then he said, "Dad, what do you need me to do?" That is who my son is. I told him to stay where he was, that I had it handled, but that I wanted him to know. On the 4th day after my return, I called my daughter. I kept my voice completely even. I told her I was aware of what had happened while I was in Phoenix. I told her I had spoken with our attorney and with the bank's fraud department. I told her I had documentation of everything, including the document her husband had represented as coming from a law firm that did not exist. I gave her 24 hours to arrange for the full return of the $35,000. She started crying. She said her husband had told her it was all legitimate. She said she didn't know about the fake letter. She said she was sorry. She was so sorry. She hadn't realized how much pressure they had put on her mother. She had genuinely believed this was going to be paid back within the month. I let her finish. Then I told her that I had heard everything she said, and that what she did with that information was between her and her conscience. I told her that my focus right now was on the legal process, and on her mother, and on the 124 hours she had before I filed a criminal complaint. Then I thanked her for her time and ended the call. My son-in-law called me 17 minutes later. His voice did not sound like a man who makes strong eye contact and says, "Sir" and "ma'am." It sounded like a man who had calculated his position and found it worse than expected. He said the transfer had been a misunderstanding. He said the loan agreement was real and binding and I had no legal grounds. He said the attorney's letter was a miscommunication, that the firm had changed its name and he had used an outdated letterhead. He said if I filed a complaint, I would be destroying my daughter's life along with his. I listened to all of it. Then I told him that destroying a family was something he should have considered before sitting at my wife's kitchen table 4 times while I was in another state. I told him the $35,000 needed to be in our account by the following afternoon. And I told him that regardless of what he returned, I was filing the criminal complaint, because what he had done to my wife was a crime under Ohio law, and I was not going to pretend otherwise for the sake of family harmony. He hung up. The $35,000 was not in our account the following afternoon. I filed the criminal complaint. What followed was not quick. I want to be clear about that, because stories like this sometimes compress time in a way that makes justice seem faster and neater than it actually is. It took 4 months before my son-in-law was formally charged. He was charged with 1 count of financial exploitation of an elderly or disabled adult and 1 count of telecommunications fraud related to the fabricated letter. My daughter was not charged. The investigation determined that she had not known about the fraudulent document, and the prosecutors concluded that her involvement, while morally compromised, did not rise to criminal liability. I have complicated feelings about that, which I will come back to. My attorney also filed a civil suit for the recovery of the $35,000, plus the cumulative total of the 4 years of previous transfers that we could document as having been solicited under false pretenses. The civil case moved separately from the criminal case, and our attorney was careful and thorough, and 3 months after the criminal charges were filed, my son-in-law agreed to a civil settlement for the full $35,000 in cash, plus an acknowledgement of debt for $60,000 of the previous transfers, to be repaid on a structured schedule. I want to pause here and tell you something that is hard to say. During the criminal proceedings, my daughter called me 6 times. In 4 of those calls, she asked me to drop the charges or to speak with the prosecutor on her husband's behalf. In 1 call, she told me that I was punishing her for his mistakes. In 1 call, she said nothing for almost a minute, and then began to cry without saying a word, and then she hung up. I did not drop the charges. My wife called our daughter back after that last call. I did not ask her to, and I would not have told her not to. She is her own person with her own relationship with her child, and whatever I believe about accountability and consequences, I am not going to stand between a mother and her daughter. My wife told me later that she told our daughter 2 things. She told her that she was not angry with her, but that she was deeply hurt, and that those were different things. And she told her that the person she needed to be angry with was the man she had married, who had looked her mother in the eye and handed her documents containing the name of a law firm he had invented in a house where her mother was alone, while her father was caring for family, 1,100 miles away. Our daughter did not respond to that for a long time. My son-in-law pleaded guilty to a reduced charge of attempted financial exploitation, a misdemeanor, in exchange for the dismissal of the felony count. He was sentenced to 18 months of supervised probation, 200 hours of community service, and mandatory financial counseling. He received no jail time. I want to be honest with you about how I felt when the judge read that sentence. I sat in that courtroom and I listened to 18 months probation, and I thought about my wife standing at the kitchen sink when I came through the door, thin in a way that had nothing to do with diet, with a smile that did not reach her eyes, and I thought about the 7 days she carried all of that alone because she was afraid of disrupting my brother's recovery. I thought about 4 phone calls asking me to protect a man who had sat across from her at our table and handed her a piece of paper with a lie printed on it. 18 months probation was not enough. I am not going to tell you it was. The prosecutor told me it was a reasonable outcome for a first offense with full cooperation and civil restitution. My attorney said the same thing. They are probably right, in the technical sense that the legal system defines right. I just want you to know that sitting in that courtroom, I did not feel that the technical sense of right was quite the same as the moral sense of right. But I was not finished. 2 weeks after the sentencing, I met with my attorney, and we revised my will and my wife's will entirely. My son in Seattle remains a beneficiary. My daughter was removed from both documents. I did not do this in secret. I called my daughter and told her directly in a calm voice exactly what we had done and why. I told her that this was not a permanent decision carved in stone, that it was a reflection of where we were today, and that relationships can change and documents can be revised. But I told her that trust, once genuinely broken, is rebuilt through time and action, not through phone calls and tears, and that we were at the beginning of that timeline, not the middle or the end. She listened. She did not cry this time. She said she understood. I also did something my attorney did not advise me to do, but which I decided was my right. I contacted the professional licensing board that oversees financial consultants in Ohio and filed a detailed complaint against my son-in-law, attaching the guilty plea and the documentation of the fraudulent letter. I did not expect a dramatic result. What I expected was that his name would be on a record somewhere, accessible to anyone who searched it before handing him their trust. That is what happened. His consulting license was placed under review, and he was required to disclose the criminal record on any future applications. He lost 2 clients within 60 days, according to information that reached me through a mutual acquaintance. I did not celebrate that, but I did not regret it either. The money from the civil settlement came in full, $35,000, returned to the account it had been taken from. The structured repayment for the remaining $60,000 began 3 months later, and as of now, it is current. My wife and I took a trip in the spring, nothing extravagant, a week in Savannah, because she had always wanted to see it, and because I owed her something better than a year of legal proceedings and difficult phone calls. We walked along River Street in the evenings and ate at a restaurant that had been open since before either of us was born. And one night she said to me, without context, that she wanted me to know she did not blame herself anymore. She said she had been working on that. She said it had taken longer than she expected. I told her it was understandable that it had taken time. I told her that what had been done was designed specifically to override the judgment of someone who trusted the people doing it. I told her that is not a character flaw. That is the mechanism of manipulation. It depends on the goodness of the person being manipulated. Her willingness to help her daughter, her reluctance to disrupt my ability to care for my brother, her fundamental decency, those were not weaknesses. They were the qualities that someone who lacked them deliberately targeted. She nodded and looked out at the river for a while. Then she said that she thought we needed to give our daughter some time and then try again. Not with the son-in-law in the room, but with our daughter. I thought about that for a long moment. I told her I was willing to try. I told her I was not willing to pretend that the year had not happened, but I told her I was willing to try. We have had 2 dinners with our daughter since then at a restaurant, not at our house, which is a distinction I made quietly and which she accepted without comment. The conversations have been careful. There are things we do not discuss, but there are also things that we do, and those things remind me that the person sitting across the table is still my child, still someone who grew up in our house and who carries, somewhere inside her, the values we tried to pass on to her. Whether those values are strong enough to outlast the influence she spent 7 years under, I genuinely do not know. Her husband was not at either dinner. She did not offer an explanation, and I did not ask for one. My son flew in from Seattle for Christmas this past year. The first Christmas in 3 years that felt like our family rather than a performance of our family. He helped me put up the outside lights the way we used to do when the kids were young, and my wife made her mother's recipe for pecan pie, and in the evening the 4 of us played cards at that same kitchen table where so much of the difficult part of this story had taken place. At one point, after my son and my wife had gone to bed, I sat alone at that table for a while. I looked at the surface of it old oak, scratched from decades of homework and holiday dinners and bill paying and, yes, from 4 visits by a man who had calculated exactly what he could extract from the woman who lived here and had acted on that calculation. I thought about what it means to build something meant to last. A bridge, a family. You account for load-bearing capacity. You account for stress and time. You do not always account for the person who shows up with the intention to find the weakest point and push. But here is what I have learned. At 64, after all of it, the structure was stronger than they thought. My wife is stronger than they thought. I am not a man who makes decisions in anger, but I am a man who makes them, and I made them, and the structure held. That has to be enough. Most days, it is. If you are listening to this and you are in a situation that sounds familiar, an adult child, a partner, a family member who has turned what you built into something they can take from, I want to say this clearly. You are not obligated to absorb the damage to protect the relationship. Protecting the relationship is their job. Your job is to protect yourself and the person you made a life with, and the trust that makes a life possible. My son-in-law believed that my wife's love for her daughter was a vulnerability he could use. He was right that it was a vulnerability. He was wrong that vulnerability and weakness are the same thing. I have a brother in Phoenix who recovered fully from his surgery, and who called me last month just to talk, the way brothers do when they are old enough to understand that the conversations they once took for granted are no longer infinite. I have a son in Seattle who answers on the second ring. I have a wife who told me, sitting by a river in Savannah on a warm evening in April, that she did not blame herself anymore. I have a table made of old oak that has held everything we put on it. That is what I built. That is what lasted.